My name is David Stasavage. I am a professor of politics at New York University, where I also serve as the Dean for the Social Sciences. And I'm here today to talk about my book, which in English is called The Decline and Rise of Democracy, A Global History from Antiquity to Today. And this is a book that, as the title suggests, tries to cover the long sweep of democracy in many different human societies over time. And in it, I try to make some new arguments that I think diverge from what many people have suggested about the history of democracy. We're used to seeing a lot of books in English that are called the rise and decline of something, of how it goes up and then it goes down. I chose this title for a very specific reason. The main argument of the book is that, well, the Greeks of the classical period gave us the term democracy or demokratia, that there was actually a great many human societies that invented forms of collective governance on their own, independently, and that early democracy of this part was very widespread. And then I argue in the book that this was largely a small-scale phenomenon, and that as societies grew and developed, early democracy tended to often disappear. And that what happened subsequently, many centuries later, was that we saw the emergence of a new form of democracy, the democracy we know today, characterized by universal adult suffrage and free and fair elections, or at least that's the goal. And that's what we're going to call modern democracy. And so hence we have starting out with a decline of early forms of democracy and the rise of a new type of modern democracy. So what's interesting is we tend to think of technology as being something that's good for the development and maybe good for democracy. It allows people to communicate with each other. But ironically, if you go and look throughout history, the long history of democracy, the advance of technology was sometimes something that was not great for democracy. The key reason for that being that it allowed autocratic rulers to monitor their people and to control them in the way that otherwise wasn't necessarily feasible or wouldn't have been feasible. And so techniques also for developing more intensive forms of agriculture tended to make a more settled form of society where people had less opportunity to exit if they weren't happy with how a ruler was treating them. And so there are various ways in which technology tended to, at times, disadvantage democracy. We can say the same for geography, and that geography in places where the terrain was rugged, for example, or where it was hard to predict what people could produce from agriculture, that rulers would need to rule jointly with them in councils and ask them what could be done rather than knowing exactly what fraction of their agricultural harvest they could take, which would be a more autocratic way of ruling. So in sum, both geography and technology had important consequences for the path of democracy and whether it survived or not. Early democracy was characterized by generally being a small-scale phenomenon in geographically compact polities, where there wasn't generally universal participation, but sometimes there could be broad participation in local councils, and where the participation took a particularly intensive form. If you had the right to participate, then you would be engaged in meetings and collective discussions frequently. Modern democracy is, in a sense, the flip side of that. All adults, in theory, have the right to participate, but for the most part, for most people, participation in elections happens only every few years, and otherwise they're not that active politically. So modern democracy is characterized by a regime where participation is very, very broad, and this principle of universal suffrage is very strong, but participation isn't necessarily that deep. And that's one potential weakness of modern democracy. Well, I think it's important to look at the history of democratic institutions because we shouldn't necessarily assume that the form of democracy that we have, of modern democracy today, is the end state of things. We should recognize that democratic institutions have evolved over the centuries, and they may need to keep evolving in order to survive. So if we think about that, then we can look back to earlier forms of democracy and see how maybe they may have had certain weaknesses, such as an absence of broad participation, or not an absence of, but less broad participation in cases. But then we can also see that they had a form of participation that was much more intensive and regular. And so when we think about how to modernize democracy today, we might want to focus on what sort of investments can be made to better connect people to government and to allow ordinary people to participate more actively and more regularly so that they're not only engaging in politics by voting every few years. If you do read the book, which I hope you will do, please take a close look at chapter 2 on early democracy, because in that I compare and contrast the democracy of classical Greece, particularly Athenian democracy, with other forms of early democracy as they existed elsewhere in the ancient world. And I think we can learn a lot from that comparison.